Right, this is the video for 4.4c, or it's 3.4c in the 6th edition. We're going to talk about upper and lower bounds for zeros. It's sort of another way that we kind of narrow down those, the list of possible zeros that we talked about a couple of videos ago. So, what happens, and you may notice as you do a lot of synthetic division in checking for zeros, which you will, you may notice that once you get to a certain point, the numbers just keep getting bigger and bigger. Well, the bound, the upper bound, means that there isn't a zero bigger than that, and that's when all those numbers just keep getting bigger and bigger. So if we did the synthetic division with this, and you notice that this is a 1, so we're just looking at the factors of 8 for our possible zeros, right? So we'd have plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2, plus or minus 4, and plus or minus 8. Let's just do 2, and let me show you what happens. We do the synthetic division, bring down the 1, multiply, add, multiply, add, multiply, add, multiply, and then add. You notice that all of these are positive, okay? Or at least they're non-negative. It's okay if you have a 0 in there. It still would fit. But once you get everything to be positive, you have an upper bound. Okay? That means there is nothing bigger than 2 that is a 0. I don't have to try 4 and 8. Okay, so to see how it will work to eliminate some of your possibilities. Even if this were a 0, or even if 2 had turned out to be a 0, but everything else was positive, it would still be an upper bound. It would mean, yes, this is a 0, but there's nothing else bigger. Okay, so there's also a way to try to do lower bounds. Okay, so a lower bound would be when you try a negative number. So an upper bound has to be a positive number, even if there are no positive zeros. Even if you figure out from Descartes' rule of signs that there are no positive zeros, you still couldn't get a upper bound from a negative number. Okay, it's just the positive numbers that work. So let's just try a few negative numbers here. And what I'm looking for is they're not going to turn out to be all negative. They can't, because the first one is positive, right? But what it will be, if it's a lower bound, then they're going to alternate. Okay, so if it were a lower bound, it would have gone positive, then this would have had to have been a negative. So that means -1 is not a lower bound. Does that mean you're guaranteed that there's one below -1? No. No, it's not a guarantee. But it's not a lower bound. You're not guaranteed that it's not, right? So let's look here. That would be -2, so that would be 5. Well, already I know -2 is not a lower bound. Let's try -3. And that would be 4. So -3 is not a lower bound. -4. No, -4 is not going to be a lower bound. Can you see already that in order for me to get a negative, or at least a 0 there, I'm going to have to go all the way to -7. but then I get a negative, so that one needed to be. All right, we'll go one farther to -8. Okay, that would be 8, but that's still negative, so that's not a lower bound. All right, so far so good. And of course, a negative times a negative, really big positive number. I don't care what it is, it's really big positive, and that's going to be a positive number. So -9 is my lower bound. So not very helpful on the lower bound end because all of my possible zeros are bigger than -9 anyway. But remember, keep in mind that this is not tied to your possible zeros. These are only rational zeros, remember? So we could have irrational zeros, and we'll look at one of those in just a second. So oftentimes, you're just going to be doing this upper bound, lower bound thing as you're looking for zeros. But in order for there to be homework on it, or for me to test that you know it, I have to give you something else, right? So the way the homework works is that it'll just say find an integer that's an upper bound and a lower bound, right? So we're looking for the first one. It doesn't have to be tied to the possible zeros at all. So in this one, we would just start trying the positive integers. Now, it works for fractions. Like I could try 1/2 and 3/2 or whatever, but why? If we're looking for an upper bound, let's try the ones that are easiest first, right? So that'd be 2, -1. Okay, so obviously 1 is not an upper bound. So let's try 2. And 2 is not an upper bound, although I got farther than before. And I did it, right? So my upper bound is 3. All right, let's see if we can find a lower bound. You have 5, so that'd be +5, and I end up with negative again, so that's not 1. So let's try -2. So that would be 14, and that'd be +6, and that'd be -12, and that'd be 0. So this is a 0, right? -2 is a 0, and it is also a lower bound. Okay, so that means there's nothing below it, right? There's nothing below it that would be a 0. So we found 1, 0, but there's nothing below it. Here's a graph of that function, so you can see what we're finding here. Okay, so what we found was that all the zeros are less than 3, right? And here's 3. Sure enough, there they are, less than 3, and greater than 2. We found 1 0 at -2, but everything else is greater. So it's in between this range. And you see how they're all there? That's what we're finding. It's not very accurate. There, you may have the zeros down here, but we may not find an integer that fits until up here farther sometimes. That's okay. It is what it is, right? It gives us information that helps us to figure out what's going on. But it will tell us about them even if they're not rational numbers. So even if they were irrational, it would still tell us where they are. We won't be finding very many irrational, not unless we can get it to a quadratic. But because you really need a calculator to do that. But we will find them with We will find the rational ones, and we will find some of the irrational ones when we can factor it down to a quadratic and then plug it into the quadratic formula. That would give it to us. And we'll do some of those in the next video. Okay, here's your quiz question. I just want you to find the lowest integer that's an upper bound for this polynomial. Remember that it doesn't have to be one of your possible zeros that you find with that rational zeros. It doesn't have to be one of the rational zeros. We're just looking for an integer, so that means like a whole number. And it's going to be positive because it's an upper bound, right? So just find the lowest one. So just start trying them until you find one that works, that gives you an upper bound.